Now imagine this. Airplanes flying overhead, gunfire in the distance, and boats filled with enemy troops landing just outside your front door. This, young historians, was the Isle of Sark during World War II. Sark is one of the Channel Islands that sits between England and France. It is a British territory, and during World War II, it was taken over by the German army. But this quiet little island, and its people, did not roll over to the Germans. They politely fought against them, following their fearless leader. Their leader's name was Dame Sibyl Hathaway, and she was the ruler of Sark. For 5 long years, Dame Sibyl stood up to Nazi Germany, but she did it in a very surprising way. This is the story of how Dame Sibyl Hathaway fought the Germans with manners.
Hi, young historians. Welcome to another episode of Anytime Now. I'm Brooke, co-founder of Honest History. We're about to jump into a story filled with adventures and lots of potatoes. It's a story about hope and always remembering your manners. If this all sounds a bit strange, well, just wait till you hear the story. Dame Sibyl was truly an incredible person and a force to be reckoned with, as the Germans found out the hard way. So let's go learn more about her story.
Our story begins in May 1940. Dame Sibyl Hathaway walked out of her Greystone mansion and looked out at the island around her. The Isle of Sark was raised high above the ocean with cliffs that dropped sharply into the sea. All around it were choppy waters, the place of many shipwrecks. As a child, Dame Sibyl had explored every cove, cave, and cliff on this small island. She knew it like the back of her hand. At that moment, it was Sibyl's favorite time of year, spring. Sark was in full bloom. Plants grew everywhere, covering the ragged cliffs and rocky ground. You could see wildflowers of every color, pink, white, blue, purple, and yellow. In the distance, Dame Sibyl spotted cows munching on green grass, and butterflies were dancing in the air. It was the place of fairy tales. In fact, the people of Sark often said fairies lived in the ancient stones on the island. Dame Sibyl did not believe in fairy tales, but she understood why Sark inspired these magical stories. "This paradise," she said, "is an oasis of quiet and rest, unique in the present-day world." It was true. Sark was very different from the rest of Europe. You see, Sark followed a rule of law called feudalism. In Europe, this type of law ended years ago, but not on Sark. The island was one of the last fiefs in the Western world. Sark was divided up into 40 different pieces of land. All the land was managed by one person, called the seigneur if it was a man, or dame if it was a woman. He or she was the lord of the manor, and rented the land out to the people. Sibyl Hathaway was the current Dame of Sark, and as the Dame of Sark, she had complete control over the island. Feudalism began on the island in 1565, over 400 years ago. This old system of government came with a lot of strange rules. Rules that were, you guessed it, over 400 years old. For instance, a tenant had to pay Dame Sibyl 1 roster for every chimney on their house. And, according to feudal law, the dame was the only person allowed to breed pigeons. There were also no cars on Sark. They simply weren't allowed. To get around, people walked, rode bicycles, or used carriages. this wasn't too much of a problem. Sark was a small island after all. It was only 3.5 miles long and 1.5 miles wide. The people of Sark enjoyed their quiet life and did not think it needed to change. As they said, if you didn't like Sark, you could always get on a boat and leave. Dame Sibyl walked back inside her mansion to begin her day. It was a lovely, quiet morning. She switched on the radio to listen to the news. She expected to hear the usual boring reports. Nothing, however, could have prepared her for what she was about to hear. The radio announcer's voice grew very serious.
Germany has invaded Holland and Belgium.
For the past few months, Dame Sibyl had heard news about the German army. It looked like a war was brewing, but she wasn't sure how serious it was. Now, listening to the radio, it was very clear. World War II was real, and it was getting closer to Sark. Over the next few days, more news trickled in. Dame Sibyl soon learned that the German army had crossed into France. She stood outside her home and looked across the sea. France was only a few miles away. As she looked out at the water, something in the distance caught her eye. Black smoke twirled up into the air over the ocean. The smoke was coming from the coast of France. This was not a good sign. To Dame Sibyl, it only meant one thing. The German army had taken over France. After seeing the smoke, Dame Sibyl raced back into her home. She must think. If Germany now occupied France, Sark was in danger. Only a few miles of sea separated the German army from Sark's coast. A few days later, Dame Sibyl received a letter. It was from the British government. The government had decided to evacuate the Channel Islands. The letter told Dame Sibyl that she should leave Sark immediately. But Dame Sibyl wasn't convinced that this was the best way to protect the island. She needed more information. She boarded a ship to sail over to the next Channel Island, called Guernsey. I went over to Guernsey for the day to find out for myself what was happening there, Dame Sibyl said. What she found was utter chaos. People running around the island trying to gather all their belongings. Everyone was panicking. No one really understood what was happening. When Dame Sibyl sailed back to Sark later that day, she had decided. She would not abandon the island. I must stay with the people, she said. The dame trusted herself, and no one else, to protect Sark. On Sunday evening, she held a meeting and told the people her plan. I am not promising you that it will be easy, she said. We may be hungry, but we will always have our cattle and crops, our gardens, a few pigs, our sheep and rabbits. Transport to England could be arranged for those who wish to leave. But the people of Sark were not going anywhere. They decided to stay. Later that month, Dame Sibyl heard the sound of airplanes. She looked up at the clear, blue sky. There were German planes straight above her head. They were flying to Guernsey. A few minutes later, she heard a horrible sound. Bombs. Over 20 people died on Guernsey that day. Many more were wounded. 30 minutes later, the hum of the airplane engines grew louder. The Germans were flying back towards Sark. The pilots aimed their machine guns and began shooting at the fishing boats near Sark's coast. Thankfully, no one was injured. The very next day, the German army took over Guernsey. Dame Sibyl picked up the telephone to call Guernsey for news, but all she heard was silence. Her phone had been cut. We had no way of knowing what was happening in Guernsey, she said. Over the next 4 days, the people of Sark waited. Then, Dame Sibyl spotted a lifeboat in the sea. It was carrying German officers. The Germans had arrived to take over Sark. Dame Sibyl knew this was going to be an important moment. She needed to make the right impression. How should she greet the German officers? She raced back into her home to speak to her husband, Bob. "We'll put 2 chairs behind the desk at the far end of the drawing room," she told him. "It is a long room, and they'll have to walk the whole length of it, which will give us a certain advantage. That will help us to look more impressive." The German officers walked up the steep hill towards Dame Sibyl's house. She could hear the stomp of their boots as they got near her front door. Then, she heard them wiping their boots on the doormat. That was a good sign. "It is a gesture of respect to the house," Sibyl whispered to her husband. The German officers entered, unrolled a poster, and began reading off a list of their rules.
No one is to be outside between 11 p.m. and 6 a.m. All guns should be handed over immediately. No more than 5 people are allowed outside together, and no boats can be in the harbor without our permission.
Dame Sibyl responded to them in German. "Please sit down," she told them.
Hi, young historians! Time for a quick break from this amazing story to tell you a bit more about Honest History. If you're enjoying this episode, then you'll love Honest History's magazines and books. Each one is filled with important adventures through the past, like the story of Chen Yisao, a Chinese woman who commanded one of the largest pirate fleets in history, to Mansa Musa from Africa, one of the wealthiest people to ever live. You can pick up a copy or subscribe and receive 3 issues delivered straight to your doorstep every 3 months. Just go to honesthistory.co and use code AnyTimeNow for a 10% discount. That's honesthistory.co and special promo code AnyTimeNow. Okay, let's get back to the story.
The 2 officers were shocked she spoke their language. She stood before them, confident and unafraid. The dame quickly won their respect. The people of Sark followed the German officers' rules and treated the soldiers like visitors to the island. As the Dame of Sark, Sibyl was required to invite strangers into her home. She used this opportunity to chat with the officers and find out information about their plans. She soon found out that the officers had been hand-picked. Many of them were from upper classes of Germany. These officers followed a strict etiquette or way of behaving. This got her thinking. Manners were very important to these officers. Well then, she thought, she would use manners to get what she wanted. Dame Sibyl knew that her family was respected in Germany. The Germans had a book called the Almanach de Gotha. It listed all the important and wealthy people of Europe, kings, queens, lords, and ladies. Dame Sibyl's name was in this book. As soon as the German army arrived, Dame Sibyl demanded respect. Every time they entered her home, the officers kissed her hand and bowed before sitting down. Dame Sibyl politely told them her thoughts about their leader, Adolf Hitler. She did not like him very much. And on several occasions, she respectfully declared that Germany would lose the war. Her actions showed the Germans that Sark was her island. The dame convinced the Germans to let her people stay on the island. She stopped the officers from destroying buildings for firewood and taking all the people's animals and gardens. In short, she did everything she could to make German occupation easier for her people. But life was still very difficult. Miles of barbed wire surrounded the people of Sark. Dame Sibyl tried her best to keep everyone together, but eventually, many men, women, and children, including her husband, were taken from the island. Electricity, medicine, and fuel were all in short supply, and there was simply not enough food to feed so many people. In the winter, the hungry German officers began stealing chickens and pigs. Dame Sibyl's patience was wearing thin. Then, the Germans ordered Dame Sibyl to hand over all the grain and most of the island's potatoes. That was the last straw. She began to craft a sneaky plan. She was going to steal back the grain and hide every last potato. One evening, while the officers ate dinner, Dame Sibyl and 3 men snuck into the village hall. This was where the Germans stored the grain. Sibyl stood outside the hall to keep watch as the men pulled bags of wheat into a cart. Silently, they pushed the cart back to her barn to hide the wheat. Next, she told her people to bring as many potatoes as they could to her house. She placed all the potatoes under a trap door in her drawing room. For the next few weeks, Dame Sibyl secretly handed out wheat and potatoes to the people of Sark. Every Saturday night, Dame Sibyl remembered, I went to bed thanking God we had survived one more week. Dame Sibyl spied British planes flying overhead and watched gunfire across the sea in France. She had a feeling the war would be over soon. And she was right. In 1945, nearly 5 years after the Germans invaded, Dame Sibyl turned on the radio.
Hitler is dead!
The voice on the radio announced. Dame Sibyl could not believe it. It was only a matter of hours before the total surrender of Germany, she said. The Germans would have to leave the island. Sark would be free at last. The people of Sark waited for days in excitement. Finally, Dame Sibyl spotted a boat in the ocean. It was carrying British officers. When the officers landed, Dame Sibyl ran out to the harbor to greet them. Unfortunately, the soldiers could not stay. They were needed elsewhere.
Would you mind being left for a few days?
The British officer asked. The thought made Dame Sibyl laugh. As I have been left for nearly 5 years, I can stand a few more days, she said. And with that, she was left in charge of the island, including 275 German troops who still lived on it. You can imagine how much fun she had ordering around the German officers. The Isle of Sark was hers to rule again. For 5 difficult years, the Dame of Sark politely stood up to Nazi Germany. She defended the island not with weapons, but with manners. And the people of Sark followed her lead. Together, they were able to save their little island and its unique way of life. Today, Sark is a little bit different. For one thing, feudalism ended on the island in 2006. It is no longer ruled by the lord of the manor. Many things, however, have stayed exactly the same. If you ever find yourself on the island, you'll see plenty of bicycles and even some horse-drawn carriages. Cars are still not allowed on the Isle of Sark. Sitting high above the sea, you can hear the sound of waves hitting the cliffs, seagulls squawking above, and the moo of cows in the fields. It is, as Dame Sibyl rightly said, an oasis of quiet and rest.
Welcome back. Dame Sibyl spent 5 whole years in a situation she never wanted to be in. She used her wit to force the invading Nazis to follow her lead in order to protect her people and her land. Dame Sibyl's story is an important reminder that simple manners can go a long way and that you don't need to be physically strong in order to defeat an invading force. That's all for now, but if you want to learn more about people who shifted the tides of war, be sure to check out issue 6 of Honest History magazine, A Secret Mission. You can learn all about the Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare and learn cool ways to pass secret messages to your friends. See you all next time! This episode was hosted by Massari and written by Heidi Coburn. Production was led by Randall Lawrence. To learn more about this episode, including more about the host, visit us at honesthistory.co and follow along for updates on social media at Honest History.
When you think about history, are there lots of old guys wearing wigs and stockings? When you think about history, is Napoleon really short? And folks have wooden teeth. Do you know that history can be the most incredible, amazing stories for you and me? Sit back and listen to a story right now. It's honest, it's fun, and it's sure to